Alex sat in the cold, sterile office of the divorce lawyer, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The silence between him and Sophie, his wife of 7 years, was unbearable. He glanced over at her, noticing how different she looked. Her face was tense, and her once bright eyes were dimmed by months of emotional exhaustion. Sophie's normally warm, free-spirited nature seemed buried beneath layers of resentment and sadness. It hurt Alex to look at her, but it hurt even more to look away. The lawyer entered the room, shuffling papers, and broke the oppressive silence. "All right, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, let's get this over with." His voice was professional, almost indifferent, as if divorces like theirs were a routine matter. In reality, it wasn't the first time Alex had been to this office. He and Sophie had discussed the terms of the divorce for months now. He thought he was ready to sign the papers, to finalize the end of everything. But as the moment drew closer, doubt gnawed at him. Memories of their first meeting played in his mind, like an old film reel he couldn't turn off. It was 5 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding. Sophie had been laughing, her joy infectious, and Alex had been captivated by her easygoing nature. They had danced all night, and the connection between them was undeniable. They fell in love fast and hard, moved in together, and started building a life. But somewhere along the way, life's demands had drained the love that once burned so brightly between them. Alex glanced at Sophie again, hoping to find some sign of the woman he'd fallen in love with, but she remained distant, staring at the wall. The love they once had seemed so far away, unreachable. The lawyer pushed the papers toward them. Just a few signatures, and it's done. Suddenly, Alex's throat tightened. His chest ached with something he couldn't explain. Before he even knew what he was saying, the words escaped his mouth. "Wait?" Both Sophie and the lawyer looked up in surprise. Alex's heart raced, his palms sweaty. "Before we sign this," he began hesitantly, "I want to make love to Sophie. One last time." The room fell into a stunned silence. Sophie's eyes widened in shock. For a moment, she thought she hadn't heard him correctly. "What?" she whispered, her voice incredulous. Alex swallowed, his voice steady but his heart pounding. "Before we end everything, I want to make love to you, Sophie. One last time. No strings attached, no expectations. I just want to feel close to you again, even if it's for the last time." Sophie sat frozen in her chair, unsure how to respond. Of all the things she had imagined happening in that office, this wasn't one of them. Anger, confusion, and something she didn't want to admit, a flicker of desire, swirled inside her. Alex's request sounded absurd, selfish even. How dare he ask this of her after all the pain they'd gone through? After months of living like strangers under the same roof, after the endless arguments and the cold distance? "I'm serious, Sophie," Alex said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I'm not trying to manipulate you. I want to end things on a different note. If this is really the end, let's remember what we once had, just for a night." Sophie's immediate reaction was to reject the idea outright. Her pride screamed at her to walk out of the office and never look back. But there was something in Alex's eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't seen in a long time, that made her pause. She remembered the man she had fallen in love with, the one who used to hold her in the middle of the night and tell her everything would be okay. She remembered their laughter, their dreams, the way they fit together so perfectly, like two pieces of a puzzle. Her heart ached with the memory, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to wonder. What would it be like, one last time? Would it give her the closure she needed? Or would it reopen old wounds? "I don't know if this is a good idea," she finally said, her voice wavering. "Neither do I," Alex admitted. "But please, just consider it." The lawyer, sensing the emotional tension in the room, cleared his throat awkwardly. "I think it's best if we give you two some time to think," he said before excusing himself. Once they were alone, Sophie finally met Alex's gaze. She saw the desperation in his eyes, but also something deeper, regret, maybe even love. After a long silence, she took a deep breath. "Okay," she said quietly, "one night, but that's it." Alex nodded, relief washing over him. He knew it wasn't a solution to their problems, but it was a chance, one last chance to connect with the woman he still loved, even if they were on the verge of losing everything. Later that night, Sophie stood outside their old apartment. She hadn't been back there in weeks, having moved into a separate apartment after their decision to divorce. The place looked the same, but it felt different, like a museum of their past, filled with memories of the life they had once shared. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled with the keys. She wasn't sure what to expect. Would it be awkward? Would they end up fighting again? Or worse, would they just go through the motions, empty of any real connection? When she opened the door, Alex was already inside. He looked nervous, pacing the living room like a man who wasn't sure how to say what was on his mind. He stopped when he saw her, offering a small, tentative smile. "Hi." "Hi," Sophie replied, feeling the awkwardness between them. The tension was thick, heavy with unspoken words and lingering emotions. The apartment hadn't changed much since she had left. The same couch, the same pictures on the walls, the same kitchen where they used to cook together. But everything felt different now, as if the weight of their impending divorce had cast a shadow over every corner. "Do you want a drink?" Alex asked, motioning toward the kitchen. Sophia shook her head. "No, I think we should just get this over with." Alex nodded, though he seemed disappointed by her tone. He led her to the bedroom, the place where they had once shared so many intimate moments. But now, it felt like a stranger's room, cold, distant, unfamiliar. They stood awkwardly by the bed, neither of them sure how to begin. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to feel so detached. But as Alex reached out and gently touched Sophie's arm, something shifted. The touch wasn't just physical. It was a reminder of who they used to be, of the love that still lingered beneath the surface, no matter how much they tried to ignore it. Without saying a word, they began to undress, their movements slow and hesitant. It wasn't about lust or desire. It was about connection, about remembering what they had lost. And as they came together, it wasn't just their bodies that met. It was their hearts, their souls, aching for something they couldn't quite define. The room was quiet, the air heavy with unspoken emotions. Alex and Sophie lay next to each other in bed, their bodies still entwined, their breathing slowing. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective, filled with the weight of everything they had just experienced. Sophie stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had expected the night to feel empty, like a formality before they officially ended things. But it hadn't. There was something in the way Alex had held her, in the way he had kissed her, that made her feel alive again, connected to him in a way she hadn't been for months. Alex broke the silence first. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. Sophie turned her head to look at him. His face was soft in the dim light, his expression vulnerable. She thought about it for a moment before answering. "No," she whispered. "Do you?" Alex shook his head. "No, I don't." The silence returned, but it was different now, less awkward, more contemplative. They both lay there, side by side, lost in their own thoughts. The weight of their marriage, their struggles, their impending divorce hung over them, but so did something else, something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As the hours stretched into the night, Sophie and Alex found themselves talking, really talking, for the first time in what felt like years. It wasn't just small talk or polite conversation. It was raw, honest, and filled with vulnerability. They talked about the beginning, about how they had fallen in love so quickly, about the nights they stayed up late planning their future. They talked about the moments of happiness, the laughter, the adventures they had shared. But they also talked about the cracks that had formed along the way. Alex admitted that he had thrown himself into his work to avoid facing the problems in their marriage. He had thought that providing for Sophie financially was enough, that it would make up for his emotional absence. But he realized too late that it wasn't. Sophie opened up about how lonely she had felt, how she had tried to communicate her needs but felt like Alex wasn't really listening. She had started to resent him for always putting work first, for not making time for her, for not fighting for their relationship when things got tough. The more they talked, the more they realized that the breakdown of their marriage wasn't just one person's fault. It was both of them. They had both made mistakes, both let their fears and insecurities get in the way of their love. By the time the sun started to rise, they had unpacked years of unresolved issues, misunderstandings, and regrets. It was painful, but it was also cathartic. For the first time in a long time, they understood each other. And with that understanding came the possibility of something neither of them had expected, a second chance. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting a golden glow over the rumpled bed where Alex and Sophie lay. The quiet felt different than the silence that had suffocated them for months. This was peaceful, almost hopeful. Sophie stirred first, stretching out under the warm sheets. Her body ached, not from physical exhaustion, but from the emotional weight of the night before. She turned her head slightly and found Alex already awake, lying beside her, his eyes filled with a tenderness she hadn't seen in so long. "Morning," he whispered, his voice low and uncertain, as if afraid to break whatever fragile truce they had forged. "Morning," Sophie replied softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. But as the haze of the night's intimacy began to clear, reality set in. They were still on the brink of divorce, still teetering on the edge of a broken marriage. The questions that had plagued her before, the anger, the frustration, the sense of betrayal, hadn't magically disappeared. Alex propped himself up on one elbow, his expression serious. "I meant everything I said last night," he began, his eyes searching hers. "I don't want to lose you, Sophie. I don't want this to be the end. I know I've made mistakes. I know I haven't been the husband you needed me to be, but I still love you. I've always loved you." Sophie sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders as if shielding herself from the vulnerability of the moment. "Love isn't enough, Alex," she said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. "We tried. We loved each other. But look where we ended up. Love alone didn't fix anything." Alex's face fell, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. He knew she was right. Love wasn't enough. Not without effort, without communication, without the willingness to change. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. We don't have to go back to the way things were. I don't want that either. But what if we tried again? What if we tried to build something new?" Sophie looked at him, her heart torn between the part of her that wanted to believe him and the part that was terrified of getting hurt again. She had given so much of herself to their marriage, and when it began to crumble, it felt like she had lost pieces of herself along with it. But there was something in Alex's eyes, something genuine and raw, that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. "Do you really think we can fix this?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Because I don't want to go through this again, Alex. I can't." Alex reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I don't have all the answers, but I know I don't want to give up on us. Not yet. I'm willing to fight for this if you are." Sophie looked down at their intertwined hands, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to say no, to protect herself from the possibility of more pain. But another part, the part that still loved Alex, still believed in what they had once shared, wanted to try. "Okay," she whispered, her heart pounding, "but we need help. We can't do this on our own." Alex nodded, his relief palpable. "I'll do whatever it takes." They agreed to start counseling, to confront the issues that had driven them apart. It was a turning point, an acknowledgement that while their love hadn't been enough to save their marriage the first time, it might be enough to help them rebuild it. In the weeks that followed, Alex and Sophie embarked on the painful but necessary journey of rebuilding their relationship. They attended marriage counseling sessions where they confronted their individual failures and learned how to communicate in ways they hadn't before. The counselor, a patient and insightful woman named Dr. Caldwell, helped them navigate the complex emotions that had been festering beneath the surface for years. Their first few sessions were tense, filled with awkward silences and defensive remarks. Sophie had a hard time letting go of the resentment she'd carried for so long, and Alex struggled to express his emotions without shutting down. But as the sessions progressed, they began to unpack the layers of hurt and misunderstanding that had poisoned their relationship. Alex learned how his obsession with work had made Sophie feel invisible, how his need to succeed in his career had overshadowed his role as a husband. Sophie, in turn, realized that she had never truly communicated how lonely she felt, assuming Alex should have known without her having to say it. They were both guilty of expecting the other to read their minds, of allowing their unspoken needs to fester into resentment. The process was slow and often painful. Some days, they left the counselor's office feeling more distant than when they'd arrived. But other days, they felt glimmers of hope, moments of connection that reminded them why they had fallen in love in the first place. One night, after an especially difficult session where Sophie had opened up about how abandoned she had felt, Alex came home with a small bouquet of wildflowers. It was a simple gesture, but it took Sophie back to the early days of their relationship when Alex would surprise her with flowers just because. "I know it doesn't fix everything," Alex said as he handed her the bouquet, "but I want you to know that I'm trying." Sophie took the flowers, her heart softening. "Thank you," she whispered, a small smile playing on her lips. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture, but it was a start. As the counseling sessions continued, Alex and Sophie found themselves slowly rediscovering the romance that had once defined their relationship. It wasn't the fiery passion of their early years, but something deeper, more intentional. They began spending time together in ways that felt meaningful, rebuilding the intimacy that had eroded over time. One weekend, Alex surprised Sophie with a trip to the art gallery where they had gone on one of their first dates. Sophie, an artist herself, had always loved the serenity of the gallery, the way it inspired her creativity. They walked through the exhibits, their hands brushing occasionally as they admired the paintings. It felt easy, natural, like they were slipping back into an old rhythm. Later, as they sat on a bench outside the gallery, Sophie turned to Alex, her heart full. "I missed this," she admitted. "I missed us." Alex smiled, his eyes soft with affection. "Me too. I don't want to lose this again." The night didn't end with grand declarations or promises of forever, but with a quiet understanding that they were both committed to rebuilding their marriage, piece by piece. Sophie, in turn, found herself rekindling her own passions. She started painting again, something she had abandoned in the midst of their marital struggles. Alex encouraged her, setting up a small studio in the corner of their apartment where she could work. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Sophie, proof that Alex was beginning to see her again, to appreciate the things that made her who she was. The little gestures began to add up, and slowly but surely, the tension that had once dominated their relationship began to lift. They laughed together again, cooked dinner together, shared quiet moments over coffee in the morning. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, of fear that they might fall back into old patterns. But they were trying, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Months passed, and Alex and Sophie's relationship continued to evolve. The divorce papers, once a looming presence in their lives, were now buried in the back of a drawer, forgotten. They were still cautious, still navigating the delicate process of rebuilding trust, but there was a lightness between them that hadn't existed before. One evening, after a particularly emotional counseling session, they sat on their balcony, watching the sun set over the city. The conversation had been hard, as they delved into some of their deepest fears. Alex's fear of failure, Sophie's fear of being unloved. But rather than driving them apart, the vulnerability had brought them closer. Sophie leaned her head on Alex's shoulder, her heart full of gratitude for how far they had come. "Do you think we'll ever stop being afraid?" she asked quietly. Alex wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "I don't know," he admitted, "but maybe it's not about being fearless. Maybe it's about being brave enough to keep trying, even when we're scared." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with love for the man beside her. They weren't the same people they had been when they first fell in love, and that was okay. They had changed, grown, and learned from their mistakes. What mattered now was that they were willing to keep fighting for each other. I'm glad we didn't give up, Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the city below. Me too, Alex replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Me too. As time passed, Alex and Sophie's marriage transformed into something neither of them had expected. A relationship built not on the naive belief that love could solve everything, but on the understanding that love required work, patience, and commitment. They still attended counseling, but the sessions became less about healing old wounds and more about strengthening the foundation they had rebuilt. They learned how to communicate better, how to express their needs without fear of judgment. They learned that it was okay to lean on each other, to be vulnerable, to admit when things weren't perfect. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Alex turned to Sophie with a serious expression. I know we've been through a lot, and I know we're still figuring things out, but there's something I need to say. Sophie looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. What is it? Alex took a deep breath, his eyes full of love and determination. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I don't just want to be your husband. I want to be your partner, your best friend. I want us to keep growing, to keep learning how to love each other better every day. I know I'm not perfect, but I'm willing to keep trying. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she listened to him. She had heard so many promises from Alex over the years, but this time felt different. This time, she believed him. I want that too, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I want us to keep fighting for each other. I want us to be better. They kissed, and in that moment, Sophie knew that they had reclaimed their love. Not the perfect, idealized love they had once dreamed of, but something deeper, something real. It wasn't the end of their journey, but the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, resilience, and the promise of a future built on the lessons of their past. And as they held each other in the quiet of their home, Sophie knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger, wiser, and more in love than ever before. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.